Hey guys, so my name is Swapnil and I've got with me the Realme 6 and the Redmi Note 8 Pro. What we've been doing with this is, of course, you've seen the performance testing part of these two smartphones, and we've also gone out and shot with both of the phones to sort of see which of the two offers a better camera. Before we actually get into the images, let's just quickly recap the specs on both the phone's camera units. Now, on the back, both of them feature a 64 megapixel sensor for the primary lens. The Realme 6 has an aperture of f1.8, whereas the Xiaomi Note 8 Pro has an aperture of f1.7. They're both using the same 64 megapixel sensor though. Then you've got an 8 megapixel ultra-wide camera with an aperture of f2.2, a dedicated 2 megapixel macro camera with an aperture of f2.4, and a 2 megapixel depth camera on the Note 8 Pro, and the same 2 megapixel sensor is in monochrome on the Realme 6. Now, essentially, lens to lens, they're practically the same cameras, near identical. Once again, this is a very common theme between the two phones. And on the front is where things are a little different. The Realme 6 has a 16 megapixel camera in the front with an f2.0 aperture, whereas the Note 8 Pro gives you a 20 megapixel sensor with again an f2.0 aperture. So that is the basic spec part. The same sensor, the same lens, but if it's implemented by two different OEMs, different results. So that's sort of what we set out to kind of figure out. Where is the difference, which is better, and how far can you push these two smartphone cameras? So when we actually take samples, we see from the Realme 6 and the Redmi Note 8 Pro, in good lighting conditions, both of these cameras are actually able to produce very good images. So the color reproduction is solid. In terms of the contrast, now depending if you like high contrast images, you may prefer the Realme 6. If you prefer slightly lower contrast, which can also make the image appear slightly less sharp, then the Note 8 Pro is a better option. Either of those two does not make a camera better or worse. It really does come down to personal preference. However, that being said, lower contrast could slightly be a better idea simply because you can always add it, but reducing the amount of contrast in an image definitely tends to impact overall quality in edit. So we see that the corners are on both the cameras are consistently sharp, especially in good light, so we don't see any distortion of any kind when shooting from the regular camera. Now in the 64 megapixel image mode, which is outputting the native resolution of the sensor, we see slightly lesser sharpness in comparison to its 16 megapixel bin counterpart. Although the color attributes remain the same, the contrast level remains the same. So the images, honestly, the only difference really ends up being in the amount of one, the resolution captured, and two, the overall sharpness. The 64 megapixel image, when put side by side with the 16 megapixel counterpart, definitely appears less sharp. But of course, you can always make it appear sharper. Let's talk about low light. Now, in low light situations, you'll shoot in one of two ways. Either you'll just whip out your camera and take a photo, or you're going to whip out your camera, put it in night mode, and then take a photo. So we tested for both. Now, in low light situations, both the Realme 6 and the Note 8 Pro produce images that are not ideally the best we've seen from a smartphone. Of course, given the price point, this is acceptable. When shooting in normal mode, here is the basic characteristic of an image. The dynamic range is significantly reduced. The shadow areas tend to have very little dynamic range, often losing complete detail. As you can see from the bottom left corner of the sample image on your screen, there is very little detail left, and in fact, in a lot of cases, even the text in my sample images is not visible, or rather it's not legible. So that doesn't speak very well for the noise reduction being applied to these images in the regular mode. Now, when you switch things up to night mode, here's how it changes. Your photo is a lot brighter from both the cameras. So they're both sharing that same property. And the noise reduction is also very similar. However, the Realme 6 has just ever so slightly better reproduction in terms of detail. The Redmi Note 8 Pro's camera sample from the night mode tends to really kill all of the detail in the images. It just appears extremely smudged. But whereas the Realme 6, that's not entirely the case. Again, there is aggressive noise reduction. There is very little detail, but it's just a hair higher than that of the Redmi Note 8 Pros. Now, the good part is that night mode is a software implementation. So, technically, both Realme and Redmi could issue patches that improve the night mode. But as of now, the way it stands, the Realme 6's images is just a hair more usable than the Redmi Note 8 Pros. However, in my personal, very, very personal opinion, I would not use either of them. I would call both of those images unsatisfactory. Now let's step out of the lab and go outside into the real world and take some photos. Yeah. I started with the ultra wide camera first and noticed that the photos from both the cameras are actually again very impressive. They have the same field of view, so it's practically the same ultra wide lens on both the cameras as well. But the image coming out varies. The Realme 6 has a slightly cooler white balance, whereas the Redmi Note 8 Pro tends to produce a significantly warmer photo. Given by what was visible to the human eye at the time, the Realme 6 is a little more closer to life, but at the same time, has a lot higher contrast compared to the Note 8 Pro's images. It'll really come down to personal preference if you like the contrast or not. Personally, for me, it makes the image appear a little darker when it should not be the case. But that being said, it's a far more balanced photo compared to that of the Redmi Note 8 Pros. That's on the ultra wide lens. Now, moving over to things like how the cameras handle flare, backlighting, things like that. Now, this is a very interesting one. When it comes to handling flare, which will happen if you're taking a photo and the sun tends to be in the frame at an odd angle behind a subject. Now, in that case, the Redmi Note 8 Pro's camera is far better than the Realme 6. I'm not sure why that is the case, to be very honest, because when shooting, we make sure that we clean the lenses before most shots. We make sure that the lenses are clean so that there is no reason for the softness to be in the image or unwanted artifacts to be in the image. But we can clearly see from the sample here that in the Realme 6's image, the sun flare is noticeable across the right side of the frame, whereas in the case of the Redmi Note 8 Pro, is just this nice, beautiful star in the middle of the frame, on the side of the frame, and not like a full-blown flare. So artistically, you may like the flare, but for some people, it may not work. But from a technical standpoint, the Note 8 Pro's camera does handle unwanted sun flares a lot better than the Realme 6. That also continues to trend of focusing on subjects that are backlit. Now, if you're shooting somebody or something that is strongly backlit, for example, let's say you want to shoot a flower, like I tried with the sun in the back, the Redmi Note 8 Pro is better and more reliable when it comes to focusing on the subject, but the Realme 6 really struggled. So the only way to get the Realme 6 to actually focus was to change the frame so that the flower is not backlit and then bring the phone back down. So it was essentially what that led to was if you had to shoot that image, I would not have been able to, at least not with the flower in focus. So there the Realme 6 does win out in clearly, hands down. Then with respect to the quality of that image, we shot the same thing in 16 and 64 megapixel resolutions to see which of them had better dynamic range and better colors. Surprisingly, if it wasn't for the watermark on the Redmi Note 8 Pro's image, it would be very difficult to tell the 16 megapixel output apart. They're almost identical in terms of the sharpness, the color reproduction, the dynamic range. It's impressive throughout. The difference really comes out in the 64 megapixel mode, where the Realme 6's camera has slightly lower dynamic range. And by that actually, I mean that the fact that the sky is actually blown. Whereas in the Redmi Note 8 Pros, you can still see hints of blue in the sky, which means it's retained that the blueness of the sky. So again, there the Redmi Note 8 Pro wins out. One area where both the cameras failed was in focusing on this red flower. Now, typically, camera sensors, and that's not just smartphones, but sometimes even point and shoot and even DSLRs, they struggle with specific shades of red. And with these two cameras, the Realme 6 and the Redmi Note 8 Pro, the problem is significantly pronounced. They cannot focus on something that's pure red, pure pink, or any of the shades in between. We've had a lot of problem getting them to do that. Then moving on to the macro capabilities of both these smartphones, we've got this one sample here, and It's very surprising because when you look at these images on the screen of the smartphone, they look amazing, which means if you were to share them on your social media platform or share it with friends who are also going to watch it on their smartphone display, they will look amazing. But the minute you start zooming in, you start to notice how little detail they actually have. And if you're somebody who's been using a DSLR and like the fact that your images have details, this is going to disappoint. But if you're not one of those, you'll not know the difference. In the case of this image of the yellow flower with the green background, here's basically what happens. The detail at the center of the flower, which was the focus point, is absolutely missing. There's nothing there. And that's, of course, when you zoom in at 100%. And that's the case with both the samples. The image is sharper from the Note 8 Pro, whereas the one from the Realme 6 is a little softer. And do note that this is not just one image that we took. We actually shot this same scene in 7, 8 different photos to make sure that there was no shake, there was no misfocusing and all of that. So these are going by the best samples available. And ideally, you would not want to ever zoom into 100% when you're shooting on macro mode. The other problem with shooting in macro is that you can get actually so close to the subject that depending on where the light is falling from, you may actually end up casting a shadow on the subject itself. So for example, if you go like that close, there is a shadow on the subject, it'll mess with your exposure. The other thing to note about the macro camera is that it is not suited for low light use at all. Okay. So that about wraps up our comparison of the Redmi Note 8 Pro and the Realme 6. So I'm going to sum things up for you. In terms of good day light performance, shooting outdoors, both the cameras, their bin results are near identical. Good luck telling them apart. But where the experience differs is with focusing. The Realme 6 and Note 8 Pro are pretty good at focusing on subjects, but the Note 8 Pro comes out ahead because of its ability to focus on backlit subjects a lot more easily and reliably than the Realme 6. Both the phones do suffer when it comes to focusing on the colors red and pink, so that's a weakness that's shared across both the smartphones, and therefore there is no clear winner in that area. In terms of dynamic range, again, because they're using the same sensor, the regular wide-angle camera tends to produce impressive results from both of these cameras, but the 64 megapixel output is slightly just a hair better from the Note 8 Pro in terms of its dynamic range. The ultra-wide camera on both of these smartphones is again very much the same, but the Redmi Note 8 Pro has better flare control than the Realme 6. However, the Realme 6's image is sharper, more consistent across the center and the edges, and is definitely a far more usable image than the Redmi Note 8 Pro. So there is that unfortunate back and forth between the two, but if I had to pick one, it would be the Realme 6 for the ultra-wide camera. In terms of the macro camera, both of them somewhat disappoint, but honestly, if you just had to share it on your social media or share it with people who will watch the photos only on their phones, then the result from both of them is equally impressive, but the cameras are not usable in low light. Speaking of low light, the Realme 6 has a hair better image quality reproduction when it comes to low light, simply because its noise reduction algorithm is a little less aggressive than that on the Redmi Note 8 Pro. What that means is that when shooting in low light or using the night mode, the Realme 6's results will have slightly better detail in comparison to the Note 8 Pros, whereas every other attribute tends to remain the same across the board. Therefore, the Realme 6 is just a hair better in terms of low light, but then again, Redmi could just as easily catch up with a software update. So that is essentially a summary of the camera comparison between the Realme 6 and the Redmi Note 8 Pro. You can see all of the image samples in their full resolution, absolutely unedited glory on our Flickr page. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So thank you guys for watching. And before I sign off, I would like to say, do subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon if you want to make sure that you do not miss any of our test-based content. So thank you guys for watching.